syndications that I've been talking about over the last few months, this is a third one, are actually set up and what the legalities are behind them and why we can now do them and why the SEC allows these. Correct me if I'm wrong, James, but before, I think was 3 or 4 years ago, you kind of weren't allowed to do them, and they changed the regulations. So there are more opportunities for investors to become involved in multifamily or whatever types of syndication, real estate syndication that you can come up with. So I guess we'll kind of just jump right into it. And James, you have, I'm going to try to give you access to share your screen.
Okay.
And why am I not seeing how to do that? Okay, there you go. Now you should be able to share your screen, and you can, I'm really interested in this topic as well, and learning more about it. I do pay a lot of attention to people that are talking about these, but it's really interesting when an actual attorney that sets them up talks about them, I always find. So I'll hand it over to you, James.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody. Ryan, good to see you again. Donna, I don't think we've met, but nice to meet you. And Britton, I know we've talked via email, but I don't think we've ever met in person. So nice to meet you. Yeah, so Jason asked me to give you enough to understand syndications and we'll call it joint ventures and partnerships. So structures of ways to bring investors into buying what this particular asset is, or security potentially, or asset is, which is real estate, commercial or residential rental properties. As you'll see in there, I'm an attorney downtown with MPL Law Firm. I focus on business transactions and part-time general counsel work. But you know, just to give you a little background on my career, I didn't practice law my entire career. I spent the better part of it up on Wall Street for the first 10 years. And then 2010 to 2017, I owned 2 businesses, but I've been a licensed attorney the entire time. So when I talk to you, it might not be in the same manner that you would hear from somebody that spent their entire career in a law firm, but hopefully what I share with you is usable and impactful nonetheless. So tonight we'll talk about the following topics. What is a real estate syndication and or a joint venture partnership? Who are the typical investors? How do you raise funds under this, under either scenario? How are these scenarios structured from a legal standpoint? What types of documents you're going to need to put in place in order to execute on this structure, and where do you form these entities? You know, geographically, what does that mean? And then we'll wrap up with some questions. So real estate syndication and joint ventures and partnership, real simply, okay? It's just various forms of partnership between several investors. It's a way of pooling resources amongst different investor groups and or even management talents. I mean, you can bring in somebody that knows how to rehab houses and make that one LLC. You can bring in another group that knows how to manage rental properties, and you can bring in another group that knows how to run the finances. And then underneath all that, you can sit different investor groups for each property. Thought of it as another way, you know, the syndication was the original crowdfunding. It was bringing people together that weren't necessarily sophisticated investors to buy and make returns on properties. To Jason's point, people that were not necessarily sophisticated or accredited investors, it was a very loose structure and arguably not a legal structure, and people that put these together got into some legal trouble over the years until they started to write regulations and bring things to bear that would allow for this market, which has been going on for years and years and years and years, put a little more formality behind it. So
James, hey, could you identify or define what an accredited investor or a sophisticated
coming up.
investor?
Yep.
Are you already doing that?
Nope. That'll come up with the types of investors.
Nice. Okay.
Yep. So there you go, Jason. There, I'm leading you right into your
right into my next question.
So when you think about it, right, as it's set up today, think of investors in 3 categories. Okay, you've got sophisticated investors. So these are the folks that are non-accredited, and I'll get into the structure of what that means. They're the ones that understand what they're getting into, but might not meet the financial definitions as set forth by either the federal regulators, the SEC, or your state securities regulators. These are your up-and-coming doctors, your up-and-coming lawyers, your up-and-coming professionals. These are your business owners. These are, you know, folks that have excess capital to spend, but might not meet the net worth requirement or might not be making over the income threshold. These are important, and I'll show you as it relates to a couple of different ways that you can bring these investors into the fold. So just keep that in mind. Accredited investors, these guys have been around for quite a while. And there's a lot more categories to encompass accredited investors, but the 2 big ones that most people look at are, is the individual's net worth greater than $1 million? And that's not including your primary residence, okay? So in other words, if you have a $500,000 house, that's not included in your net worth. In the same regard, if you have a $500,000 house and you have a $300,000 mortgage, that $300,000 mortgage is not included as a liability either. The only way that liability gets included is if you're over leveraged on your house. So if you have a $500,000 house and for some reason, when you originally bought it, you borrowed off of a higher investment amount. So you might owe $600,000 on the house. That extra $100,000 would be counted against your net worth. The other thing that they look at is individuals in order to become accredited as individuals who make $200,000 per year or couples who make over $300,000 a year. Those are the 2 big categories that the SEC will look at in the event that there is an issue as it relates to the investment. The third category, and I'm just going to call this a catch-all. Trust me, there's a lot of different ways that everyone else fits into this, but this is where your partnerships, your joint ventures, your crowdfunding, your individuals that don't necessarily fit into the other definitions per the securities regulators, that's these folks down here. And I'll show you and I'll talk through where they fit within the various structures for syndication and or partnerships and JVs. Okay, any questions here?
No, but so the partnerships, they can, a partnership can invest in a syndication if it meets certain criteria, is what you're saying?
Yeah. Yes. Yep. But they're going to look at the partnership and see who's in the partnership. And again, depending upon what structure you're setting it up with, the people in the partnership should be what is labeled underneath the exemption that you're claiming as the structural setup.
Yeah, and that gets a little technical. You'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yep. So how are you raising funds from these types of investors? As I said, joint venture partnerships, that's how they've done it for years and years and years. Limited partnerships with a general partner. An LLC would typically be the general partner, and then you have limited investors that come in. And behind those, you have tons of documents that are showing that the risks are put out there, that people are very aware that it's not a liquid investment, and that's typically how you would see real estate purchased over the years, okay? The problem with the way that that was set up is that when you start investing that way, it starts to cross the line into the securities realm. And when you start guaranteeing returns or start talking about returns and not providing the backup information, and you start taking money from people who aren't necessarily sophisticated and or accredited, that's where the securities regulators come into play, right? But that was the vehicle for years and years and years for people to buy and pool resources to buy commercial real estate and also to buy rental properties. The two areas that people would invest and do it in a sense that they would afford themselves protection from a security standpoint, there's two exemptions that you put out there. There's Reg D 506B and Reg D 506C, and I'll get into those in a little bit. But those are ways to notify the federal regulators and then notify your state regulators that I'm raising money to do an investment fund, and that investment fund is going to be used to buy real estate or invest in a company. Those are two ways that the syndicators and or the fundraisers, that's the way that they would be able to afford themselves protection. Another way that was brought to light, especially over the last, call it 3 to 5 years, was the whole crowdfunding phenomenon. So there is where, you know, you see that somebody's putting it out on Facebook or putting it out on a website or whatsoever else. They're getting lots of little investments coming together in order to fund things like startup companies. Well, the regulators got involved and they wanted to put some guidelines around who can put money into a crowdfunding campaign and also how much can be raised under a crowdfunding campaign. And as I said, I'll get into that in a little bit more detail. And then lastly, and I had an extra bullet down there, that joint venture partnership, so I'll have to remove that. But lastly is you have your small Regulation A IPOs. It's for, in your realm, in the real estate world, that's for your larger deals, so $20 to $50 million. It's not often used, and I'm going to presume that there's probably there's not a lot going on in this local marketplace unless it's somebody coming in from a major metropolitan area. I'd love for any of you to get big enough to entertain that, and we can certainly talk that way, but I just wanted to bring it to your attention that there is a flow to this, and there is a way to kind of build up over time.
And that the Reg D exemptions are so that you don't need to do some sort of an IPO. So that's why that's what made this so attractive over the last few years, I believe, from what I understand, right?
That's correct. It's an exemption that you're claiming because your investment and people that you're bringing into the investment fit into a box, call it, right? And that box is, you know, you've got this investors that are, and I'll get into what you have to meet here for these requirements, but the investors meet a certain type, the way that you're going about raising the money, you know, is fit in a certain way, and you're giving certain notifications. So in other words, it's just a way to fast track it.
Yeah, so the SEC, we traditionally think about them regulating huge corporate entities doing an initial public offering or something like that, and now we can do that a different way because they're exempting that requirement. That was something profound that I realized after studying this quite a bit. So that's sort of brought syndications to be in arm's reach of a normal person, really. Yes.
Yep. So the simplest and easiest way was the partnerships and joint ventures. Okay. And real simply, it's the formation of a legal entity to formalize a relationship. You have a partnership or investor agreement, dictates the terms of your financial and operating relationship, and then you use the funds for investing into whatever target investment you're looking at, whether that's commercial or real estate or residential real estate or a business or such. And typically those come from self-funding, where you borrow from a traditional lending institution, or you bootstrap it with family or friends. And that's the simplest structure that you use there. In these situations, you better know who you're getting in bed with, and you better understand what their motivations are, and you better understand how to get out of it when you're ready to exit.
Right. And another interesting part about joint ventures and the way the SEC looks at them is everybody has to have a part in it. Like, you can't be passive. Like, you can't just say, here's my money, take it and do whatever you want. Is that correct, James?
I'm not aware of that regulation, Jason.
From what I understand, that's what sort of separates like a syndication from a joint venture. Is like everybody has to have sort of a role. Maybe you're doing the books, and other person's operations, another person. Everybody sort of has a role. That's from what I understand.
Yes, you have to be active in the business.
You have to be active. That's what I meant. Yeah.
You have to be Yes. And the IRS looks at it in that way, and the SEC looks at it that way. Okay. So the first exemption is a Regulation D 506B, and I'm going to get into what these look like from a structure standpoint. So somebody that's pulling money together here, there's no size limit to the offering. You can raise as much money as you'd like under this. You got to tell the SEC what your target raise is going to be. Any issuer can rely on this exemption. Okay, you cannot have any bad actors, and this is going to be across the board, whether it's 506B, 506C, or crowdfunding. Bad actors are people that have been convicted or accused of securities fraud in the past. That is the most commonly used reason why people are not allowed to, or people fall into this bad actor disqualification. And for your purposes, that's something that you will look at as you vet investors. In this situation, you can have an unlimited number of accredited investors and up to 35 non-accredited investors. Okay. If you have non-accredited investors, what you need is you need to provide certain information, and that's done typically through a private placement memorandum to those non-accredited investors. You're going to have to provide that to the accredited investors as well. And what that private placement memorandum does is it outlines all the risks of the investment, the background of the management team, what your intended use of the capital is going to be, what the exogenous or outside events that could impact the investment, making sure that they understand exactly what they're getting involved with. All of these things are outlined in a private placement memorandum, and people that are non-accredited, they sign off on it and an acknowledgement that they've received it and that they understand what they're getting involved with. It's a way to protect the syndicator in this situation, and a way for them to prove that they did in fact outline all of the risks that are part of the investment. When you are doing or claiming this exemption, you file a Form D with the SEC, which is notifying them that you're claiming a 506B exemption. And then on top of that, any investors that are in different states, you notify their state security regulators that you are doing a 506B raise. And it's not that you have to file any other paperwork with them or do any registration or notification of exemption, because federal law trumps the state law in this situation. But you're at least alerting them that there's investors in the state that are contributing or investing money with a syndicator that's claiming an exemption. You cannot generally solicit or advertise for this. So what that means is you can't go out and put an advertisement in the paper and say, hey, I've got this wonderful self-storage facility. We think it's a great investment. We're looking for investors. You can't do any of that. What you can do,
Facebook or anything else, like you can't put an ad on Facebook.
Nope.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's a big no-no, right?
It's a big no-no, but it is okay for you to go putting the word out through typical conduits like family offices. You can put them out through financial advisors, accountants, attorneys. You can go on road shows and let those people know that, hey, we're going to be talking about this investment, and then they can tell their clients to come on in. You just can't go out and publicly advertise. Does that make sense?
And the way I understand it, you have to have a personal relationship with the person, the investor, at some level, whether or not they just filled out a form and you had a conversation with them, but you have to have some sort of a conversation with them versus going through a conduit where you never talk to them.
That's correct.
That you could do with
it. You got to be careful going through a conduit. You want to make sure that you're not falling into the promoter category, or somebody else could fall into the promoter category. Right. You're getting a commission for it, and then you've got a whole different set of licensing issues and registration that needs to go on. The other thing with these investments as well is there's limitations on resale. You typically, you have to hold them for a year, and when you resell them, you cannot go and resell them to somebody that falls out of the category that what you bought it as. So you can't go sell it to an underwriter. You can't go sell it to an investment fund. You cannot, it still has to remain a private investment.
For that year?
For that year. No, you can't resell it for a year.
For a year, but after the year, you can sell it.
That's correct. That's
to whoever.
Yep.
Yeah.
But typically when you sign on with these, there's provisions in the operating agreement, provisions or provisions in the membership interest agreement for an LLC that gives the management team the right of first refusal on whomever you're selling it to. So there's extra protections put in place.
And typically these deals would be in place. You would want, if an investor would want to participate, they would expect to be part of it for 5 or more years, typically. Is that what you would kind of say, James?
Depends on the deal and what you're doing. But yeah, I mean, usually there's one of the risks that is out there is that this investment is illiquid. There's a limited amount of people that are willing to buy it and be ready to hold on to this for quite a while. You don't have an open marketplace to buy and sell this stuff.
You can't just sell your share of it and get out of it. So it's something you need to be.
You can't call up your Aunt Donna and say, Aunt Donna, I want to sell you my shares.
Yeah, right.
So
that doesn't work.
James, you're saying you can't sell your share within that first year, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, but after that, you can sell your share.
You can, but it's still subject to restrictions on who you can sell to.
Okay. But then is there any penalties on the resale of your share? Meaning, is there regulations that say, hey, I've held my share for 1 year and you're showing on your resale expected growth, so you're selling that person on the expected growth of your share. Is that allowed? Does that make sense?
It's certainly allowed. What I will tell you is that the managing or the managing member and or the general partner or however it's set up will typically have to be notified and approve any transaction that goes on.
Okay.
Because they don't want to, they don't just want you go floating off into the ether and selling to somebody they don't know. These are partnerships.
Correct. Yeah. Okay.
But you can certainly sell it for, look, I mean, if it's a good partner and they're bringing more capital to the table, and you can certainly sell it for that amount.
Gotcha. Okay.
Everybody
I didn't know
agrees.
there was limitations on the resale or the subject of the resale, putting it back out. So thank you.
Yep. Any other questions on 506B? This is kind of the in-between the crowdfunding and 506C, which I'll get into next. This gives you a little bit of non-accredited investor exposure. Okay. With 506C, right? This is the good old boys club, right? This is where you're hitting the country club, you're hitting the doctor's lounge, you're hitting, wherever, the high net worth folks. This is what you typically would want to register under. Again, no size limit to the offering. Any issuer can rely on this exemption. You still have the bad actor disqualification. Only accredited investors are allowed, and you must use reasonable steps to verify the accredited investors, same as the other one as well. So typically, I will put together a questionnaire that's included with the PPM. And that questionnaire goes out to all of your accredited investors so that you have a sign off and proof that what they're telling you is in fact they're attesting to it. The last thing you want to do is have to go out and pull tax returns and make sure that they are who they say they are. The onus is on them to attest to it. But as long as you have their signature on it, you're affording yourself some protection in the event that they didn't tell you the truth, right? Again, you file the Form D, and wherever those investors are located, that you have to notify that local state. So if you have an investor in Wyoming, you just provide notice that you're going to be selling to an investor that's in the state of Wyoming. You don't have to say who it is. You just have to notify that there's an investor in there. In this regard, because you're only targeting accredited investors, you can generally solicit and generally advertise. And you must be very clear that these have to be accredited investors. Okay? And again, same limitations on the resale here when you're claiming an exemption or 506C. This is the most restrictive of the ones that I would I see typically used in a real estate syndication. But again,
you can actually advertise on Facebook that, hey, we have this opportunity. I see that a lot. I mean, we're buying this $30 million Class A property. There's still some spots left. Contact me if you'd like to participate.
And make sure you put in there accredited investors only.
Accredited investors only, right. Yeah, they usually always put that on there. So you're saying that somebody reaches out to you through Facebook and says, hey, I'm an accredited investor, I'd like to participate. You just have them fill out a form, but you don't need to be trust, but don't verify it, or you
need to use what is reasonable.
Okay.
That's legalese for if you don't trust them or it doesn't look right, doesn't smell right, I wouldn't want to bring their money in.
Right.
Do something that shows that you're getting a little due diligence on that individual, whether it's, who's your accountant? Can I talk to them to verify? Or, don't just rely on that form. Get a little bit more background that gives you the ability to just make sure they are who they are.
Right.
Okay. Crowdfunding, and this is the whole regulation that came out, I think 2015. It's been in the last 3 to 5 years. It's a Section 4A6 exemption. So here you can, each issuer per year can raise up to $1 million. And again, you file a Form C with this, notifying the securities regulators that that's what you're doing. The parameters here, okay, you have 2 buckets basically. So individuals with an annual income or net worth less than $100,000, the max they can invest is greater than $2,000 or 5% of their annual income or net worth. So you're looking $2,000 to $5,000. That's the max that somebody that fits in that category can invest in. Folks that are greater than or making greater than $100,000 or have a net worth greater than $100,000, the max they can invest is 10% of lesser of annual income or net worth. Okay. Ineligible companies and bad actors, they're disqualified from this as well. Ineligible companies, those are issuers that have been denied this exemption in the past. Okay, they can't come out and do a regulation crowdfunding. There's other.
Have you ever seen crowdfunding used for something that would be typically used for like syndication or 506B?
I haven't done any. I've seen them through some real estate syndication companies. They talk about them, but it's just another avenue for you. So
it would be a lot of people.
You would need a lot of people, unless you're investing in New York City.
So, well, that is a good question. So would it make sense if it's a smaller project, maybe you're trying to raise $300,000 or something, to use that?
Look, man, I mean, if you've got a solid social media presence, you've got a lot of people that trust you.
Yeah.
Have at it.
Yeah, I've never even considered crowdfunding for these, but it's just not something that a lot of people talk about. But that's interesting. Okay.
And again, you have resale restrictions here. Again, same level of resale restrictions that you do under the others. You got that year lockup.
Okay.
Okay. So these are I've got two general structures. I've got this, which is a single class structure, and then I have a dual class structure. So this is your traditional partnership, joint venture, LLC setup where funds are coming in. You've got active partners, and then you go and you just invest your funds into the properties. It's pretty straightforward. There's not a lot here. You've got an operating agreement, you've got a membership interest agreement or a partnership agreement, and it's pretty simple. And you put as many properties under there as you'd like. Does it make sense?
Makes sense. Yep.
Yep. Complete.
This is a two-tier syndication structure. So when you're looking at this, okay, so Jason or Ryan or Brett, you would sit up here in the management LLC, right? You would form that, and sometimes this is two structures here. You could have a management LLC and you could have like a construction or rehab LLC. And you could have a number of different ways, but the simplest way to think about it is this is where all of the management and control sits for what's going on. And then as you go along, let's say you want to hit doctors at WellSpan. Maybe they're in investor group 1, right? So you as the management LLC, you own part of this, and then the doctors own the other part of the LLC. And you take all those funds together, and with that, that's where, depending upon what the makeup is of the investors, okay, that's the exemption you're going to claim. So if they're all accredited, what you're going to say is, I formed this investor group LLC, and now I'm going to go file a Form D with the SEC under 506C, and I'm investing, say, $5 million, and the minimum investment's $5,000. And they're going to be equity interests in this. And we're going to use the proceeds of what we invest here to buy, call it a multifamily property in Pennsylvania. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then let's say you go over to Penn State Health and you get another group of doctors. Well, you go set up another LLC, and you can, again, file your Form D, but let's say you've got a couple of nurses that want to invest with the doctors, and the nurses don't necessarily meet the threshold for accredited investors, but you've got under 35 of them, and they're sophisticated enough where they understand what they're doing. So you do a 506B here, right? And then out here, you're going to go invest in York City properties, and you've got a number of realtors, I don't know, that might not necessarily meet the thresholds for a 506C or a 506B, but maybe they meet the thresholds for crowdfunding, and then you do the regulation crowdfunding out here to invest in those properties. But in each situation, your management LLC, and the way that you structure it is, I'm coming into this LLC as a manager, I'm a manager here, I'm a manager here, and you've got that liability protection, and then you've got the property underneath. I don't typically see groups of properties under these. It's typically one property, but it doesn't mean you can't have groups of properties under there as long as that's the intended purpose of whatever your investor LLC is. Does that make sense?
So, yeah, so you help, so management LLC would be something that you would come in and structure that, file all the appropriate paperwork,
Yep.
and then for each investor group LLC, you would create another entity for each of those. That entity would purchase the property, and then you could do that however many times under the same organization.
That's right. And then I didn't put a slide out here, but there's different ways that you can bring the investors in as well. In other words, you can do waterfall provisions inside your LLC, which guarantees a certain rate of return, and then you get a kicker up here for the management, and then when you ultimately exit the property, because maybe the group's getting an 8% guaranteed return every month, right? Then they get a lesser payout of whatever your capital gains are at the end. You could have a direct profit share for the membership interest. There's a number of different ways that you can structure how the investors come in.
Okay, I don't know if you're going to get to this, but what about the tax advantages for bringing in these investors? Are you going to talk about that at all?
I'm not going to get into the tax aspect of it. That's really
At a high level, from what the one of the big reasons that people would invest in one of these properties is because they would receive the same tax advantages as the actual management of it.
That's correct. Yes, at a high level, that's the way that works.
Right.
Again, each investor group is going. It just depends on what their needs are and how you've structured it.
Sure.
As it comes through, but it's real estate investment, so it's passive income.
Very different than investing in a REIT through this stock exchange.
Where a REIT, 90% of the 90% of the profits come out as dividend income.
Right. There's no tax advantage.
No,
Right.
That's correct. Yep. All right. So you understand the two-tier structure here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Liability protection, and it gives you can approach different groups of investors for different types of enterprises. So documents that you need for all of these things: operating agreements, that's your bylaws, rules of the road for an LLC. Investor agreements, that's your buy sells, that's your, I want to sell my investment after a year. Who gets the rights to buy it? Does the company, does the management team? What does that mean? It's just a way for exiting and entering into the agreement. Private Placement Memorandum, again, if you're claiming an exemption, highly recommend that you get one of these drafted, because this is going to afford you protection in the event that you've got somebody that's not happy with what the returns are and decides to engage the securities counsel, and then ultimately report you to either the state securities regulators or the SEC. Form D and Blue Sky filings. These aren't hard forms to fill out, but it's kind of a tricky navigation process to put it into the system. And then you have your management agreements. Again, what does it mean for the management LLC? What are you actually doing? What services are you providing? How are you getting compensated? How are the funds getting used? All of that's in place, and that's why I recommend management agreements with this. The other big area is, where do you form these entities? Okay, and this isn't rocket science. Again, it's going to be dictated by what the needs are of the investors, but where are the properties located? What are the tax circumstances? That's a huge driver. Who are the investors? What are your long-term goals as a syndication group? As you grow, there are certain states that have structures that are set up where you don't have to do double work. So for example, in Delaware, they have this whole concept of what's called a series LLC. Okay, so instead of having to form new LLCs every single time, you form one series LLC, and that's the master control management group. And then each time you bring in new investor groups, you don't have to go back and file with the state of Delaware. You just write up a new operating agreement for each new series, and then that's what buys the properties. It's nice, it's convenient. I do it with a lot of investor groups that are not invested in real estate. There's no reason why you can't apply it to other types of investments. The problem with series LLCs is there's only a couple of states that are using them, and they might not get recognized in other states.
Very interesting. So do you have to be located or have an address in Delaware to use that?
You do, with a registered agent, and then you can locate your business in it wherever you're located at. Does that make sense?
So there's a particular form you just need to fill out, or?
Yeah,
as a register. There's a Delaware trust that's also, I just learned about. I can't remember the exact name of it. I was going to try to look it up, but there's a specific trust that only exists in Delaware that allows you to form these. Oh, I can't remember. I heard a little bit about it recently, and now it's eluding me exactly what it was, but it was something specific to Delaware.
Well, it's, and I'm sorry, the Knights, Delaware Trust, South Dakota Trust, Nevada Trust. There's a couple of states where they're tax advantaged as to the monies that you're putting in there. there.
Right.
And then what you can do to take those monies and invest out. The topic for another night.
Yeah, we can, that's a whole other topic for another presentation for sure.
Yep. So outside of that, I was kind of trying to stay at the high level, but what other questions do you guys have?
Honestly, I think that was very well presented, and I really enjoyed it. Learned a lot from that.
Great.
Aside, since I'm not a lawyer, that's probably as deep as I can get and actually understand. So no, it works. It's helpful to understand. I actually didn't realize that some of this stuff was so new, relatively speaking. Even the syndication things, even though we've talked about it, it seems like the stuff has been around for a lot longer. But I guess it's the new. I guess looking for new investment is the dynamic of this to help encourage people to get invested.
Maybe not so much to encourage, it's more to regulate and protect. These things have been going on for years and years and years. They just, they didn't have a structure to them.
Okay. So they're just structuring it more because I'm sure people do lose their shirts over this kind of stuff.
They absolutely do. They absolutely do.
And how often do you see these changes coming through? I mean, I know that changes are happening obviously every day, but is that something that, you have to actually follow up on, or how do you find out? I mean, I would think the way this sounds, as new as it is, everything that's changing, it's changing very rapidly.
There's always talk of change, but remember where this originates is typically in DC, and they will typically, so think about all the changes that came about with the CARES Act, right?
Yep.
Probably weren't necessarily thought through on how they were implemented, but they were all sitting in a drawer someplace, these policy papers. And somebody pulls it out and looks at it and says, all right, I want to do this, right? So really what drives the change is typically some type of catastrophe or some type of major fraud.
Okay.
Right? It's not just, the citizens are demanding regulation around crowdfunding. They're not. What they are demanding is pay me my money back because I was defrauded, and it's got to hit somebody in the pocketbook pretty dramatically. Great example of one that's still sitting out there and we're waiting on more regulations is Bitcoin. Wait till there's a major fraud with Bitcoin. You almost had it with, some of the Bitcoin originators really going out into the dark web. You had a lot of issues with where the money was going and what was happening with it, but it just never came to fruition.
Now it's on the tax returns on the first page, you have to tell the government if you even own any cryptocurrency. They're trying to pry, the decentralized point of it all is now they're trying to get their hands in there as well. Something else that I thought about was the Trump tax law that came into place for real estate is the accelerated depreciation. What can you tell us about that, if anything? What are you hearing about that?
So the accelerated depreciation took it from, what was the time frame? Went from, bear with me one second here.
So from what I understand, it's like 3 levels or 3 types of property aspects that you can depreciate. And some of them are depreciated over 15 years, 29 years, whatever it is. But you can now take that all in the first year.
That's correct.
So the tax advantages are amazing for people that participate in buying investment real estate or commercial real estate.
Bonus depreciation, 50 to 100. Yes, that's exactly what it.
Yep, really cool stuff. One of the other main reasons I became really intrigued by this. So that's one of the very new things that did change that. If the administration changes in a, a term or two, that could theoretically be reversed.
Well, I think it sunsets, is it next year? Or
Oh, is that right?
21 or 22 is when that bonus depreciation sunsets.
Okay.
You've got to put the property into service between when it was signed, I think back in 2017 and 2022. And the CARES Act may have extended that, but I don't think it did.
I hadn't heard about that. Okay. Awesome. Well, that was fantastic, James. That was a really nice high-level overview of how these things all work, because it is very complicated. It takes a lot of studying to try to understand it. So, your MPL law firm, you kind of specialize in doing these in the area. You do a lot of these, or is this?
We'll do exempt offerings, and real estate will be one area that happens in, but we'll do it with investor groups. We'll do it with financing for used cars, for example. That's another area that you can do syndications with. There's a number of different realms. It's just when you have investors that are coming together and they're not necessarily going to be active in the business, that's where you should really be putting the protections in place with an exemption offering.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. This was very informative. I really enjoyed it.
Okay, guys.
Yeah, thanks, James. Good to see you.
Yeah.
You too.
All right. Well, that's pretty good. Yeah, we're coming up on the hour, so that worked out really well.
Awesome.
There's nothing else. All right, I'll let you go, James. Thanks everybody for joining.
Yeah, thank you, Jason.
And, we're doing this once a month, so hopefully you guys will be able to join us next time.
That's good.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
See ya.